The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
This is just endlessly funny, and I wanted to talk about it with you at the top of the show today. So 2 nights ago, Donald Trump did this emergency address about something that's simply not an emergency, undocumented immigration to the United States and his desire for a border wall. And then after that, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, as the leaders of the Democrats in the House and Senate, respectively, gave this sort of awkward response speech where they were both sandwiched behind the same lectern, and it was just kind of weird. But it was still a good thing that they did it, and it was a good thing that networks covered it, because this was not a normal presidential address. It was more like a State of the Union in that it was a political speech, and as such, it made sense that Democrats be allowed to give a rebuttal and that networks cover it. We've now learned that the Democratic rebuttal speech to Donald Trump's crisis speech had more of an audience on network and cable television than Donald Trump's speech itself. And it is so funny because for the guy who is all about ratings and popularity, it's got to be killing him that he gave this ridiculous address to huge fanfare about how it's a major crisis. He's going to do a big boy and tell us what needs to happen. And then the Democratic rebuttal by the people who are telling him, we're not giving you the money for the wall, gets more of an audience than the actual speech that Trump gave. And we have preliminary numbers. Trump's speech drew a 28.1 household rating in metered markets on ABC, CBS, Fox News, NBC, CNN, and which one am I missing here? MSNBC, I guess. The following 15 minutes during which the Pelosi-Schumer rebuttal took place got a 29.3. Okay, so it's about a 4% bigger audience for the rebuttal in the same markets and on the same networks. Now, the reality is the facts don't care about your feelings, and normally the State of the Union address gets a much higher rating than the rebuttal that happens after the fact. In this case, that's not the way it went, and about 4% higher ratings for the rebuttal. So it's not a huge thing that this happened, but it is notable because, number one, you have someone whose entire presidency has been effectively predicated on how popular are they, the great ratings they got on television as a reality show host. And it has to be absolutely killing the guy. And he actually gets fuel or momentum for policy from how popular it appears to be to the American public. But we don't want to, for any moment, mistake the reality that audience size doesn't determine whether there's a crisis. Audience size and ratings don't tell us who lied and who told the truth. The popularity of a speech doesn't give us any information about what the correct policy decision needs to be, but it matters to Trump and it matters to his audience, which is what makes it hilarious. Normally, it wouldn't even be worth mentioning this, but because of Trump's temperament and his obsession with the ratings, it becomes a very interesting side story. And the one way in which it sort of does matter more in a real way is that more Americans chose to watch the adult discussion about immigration with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer than 9 minutes of Donald Trump's unhinged lies and appeals to emotion. What that might lead to is Trump flipping out on advisors who supposedly pushed him to even do this, because there's now a report in the New York Times which claims that Donald Trump didn't even want to do this speech on Tuesday night and that he thinks his trip to the border wall today, I believe it's scheduled for, is a waste of time, which would be interesting because that means that Trump is somewhat connected to reality about his waste of time strategy on this issue, and he'll be looking for people to blame given the ratings loss to the rebuttal speech. But the one way in which this could still benefit Trump is if he ends up using the address as a pretext to more credibly justify declaring a state of emergency, Pat. And that's the question mark that remains. Regardless of the ratings, is that a pretext to set up declaring a state of emergency to commandeer money for his wall?
I think it's entirely possible that he hasn't even found out about the ratings report yet, because you know how his aides give him a propaganda file twice a day and it's filled with like pictures of positive news and just Trump looking good. I think in the same way, maybe his aides are shielding him from negative news and just are trying to insulate him. So he may not even know about this yet.
It's possible that he doesn't, although it's gotten some coverage, even on networks that Trump reluctantly says that he watches. I think the one miscalculation here was that people who are already Trumpists are totally in 100% on this dumb wall. They believe there's a crisis. They want the wall, the whole thing. If you're not already in that group, if you're even moderately skeptical of the so-called border crisis or of Donald Trump as a truth teller, I don't know that you turn on that speech Tuesday night and find it so compelling that it changes your mind. I think, if anything, you realize something's not sounding quite right here, but we'll ultimately see what the impact is. We don't know it yet, that's for sure. Okay, so we've talked about how Fox News is normally the propaganda arm of the Republican Party and carries water for the Trump administration, but that you have these occasional voices of reason. Shepard Smith is one, sometimes Chris Wallace, every once in a while Judge Andrew Napolitano. One time that I can remember, Neil Cavuto talked some sense into the standard Republican talking points. And indeed, Shep Smith fact-checked Donald Trump's almost completely lie-riddled speech Tuesday evening about the non-existent border crisis. And it's pretty delightful for being Fox News. Now, I will admit to you, normally it wouldn't be news that a television channel fact-checked what a politician said. That's not normally something where we would say, breaking, fact-checking was done by journalists. But because it's Fox News, it is sort of newsworthy. This happened right between Trump's speech and the Pelosi-Schumer Democratic rebuttal a few minutes later. And it seems that if Trump's base was convinced by the speech, maybe hearing the facts from Shep Smith might pull them back in the other direction. Take a look.
President Trump speaking from the Oval Office. In a short time, there will be a response from the Democrats. He made a number of claims there, speaking specifically about murder rates among those who are undocumented immigrants. The government statistics show that there is less violent crime by the undocumented immigrant population than by the general population. He called it a crisis of the heart and soul. He talked about drug crossings over the border, but government statistics show much of the heroin actually comes not over the unguarded border, but through ports of call. He talked about undocumented crossings over the past months. In fact, the number of undocumented crossings over the southern border has been steadily down over the last 10 years, and the government reports that there is more outward traffic than inward traffic. As for the trade deal he mentioned with Mexico, which he said would pay for the wall, that trade deal is not yet complete. And the president said that law enforcement professionals have requested the $5.7 billion. It's he who requested it, and it's he who said he would own the shutdown. Nevertheless, he's making the case to keep his base together on this matter. Chris Wallace is live with us in Washington. Does that make the case, Chris, for his base?
Well, it certainly does make the case for his base. The question is that whether the base is enough, and the answer is it isn't, because the Democrats, in an election in which the border wall was a major issue, took control of the House, and they have enough votes in the Senate also to block any legislation there. You know,
this is just the facts, right? But when you hear it on Fox News, it sounds heretical. It sounds radical, because this is what the truth looks like, and it's not what you usually see on Fox News channel. It's funny that Fox News fact-checking Trump is noteworthy, but it is because they've been his propaganda arm. And I was actually looking at some of the comments on this segment and articles about it. They are filled with Trumpists calling this segment that I just played for you a hit job. Okay, think about that. Stating facts which contradict the president is seen as a hit job in some circles. But when it's Fox News, it actually matters and is important. And we should applaud them and thank them for it, because I know that it's not going to change what Fox is, that Shepard Smith every once in a while tells the truth. But you have to understand that there's a huge group of people who will reject anything they hear anywhere other than Fox News, period. So even though there are Fox News viewers who think you can't trust Shep because he comes up with this stuff, which we call the truth, merely having something like this on Fox News is important, because it actually has a much better chance of breaking through the echo chamber. If Anderson Cooper does exactly the same thing, it's fine. He should be doing it. It's not breaking through to any Trumpists who have been primed to say that's fake news and they're lying and we have the alternative facts. When Shep Smith does it on Fox News primetime, it actually might get through to some of those Trumpists. Not all. I mean, many people, as I said, already hate Shep Smith, and every time he says something that's true, they start saying homophobic things about him. But some fraction of the Fox News audience, Pat, might see this and say, maybe I do need to reconsider, because even Fox News seems to be telling me that the president isn't being upfront here.
And you best believe that the president is ticked off about this. Generally, Sean Hannity is on during the 9 o'clock slot. But maybe because of this special event, the presidential address, they had Chris Wallace there and, of course, Shep Smith. I don't know if the Trump team anticipated that, but it was a bad calculation in that case, because they probably would have pushed it to a different time when they had a more favorable Fox News host on.
Well, usually Fox just puts on Shep and Chris Wallace, I think, no matter when these things would have been. I think even at a different time, they still bring on the same team for these special events. One other talking point that has been spreading is that the Democrats aren't proposing anything to stop the shutdown and move forward. And there are people who are falling for Trump's claim about that. And it should be repeated widely that the House already passed a bill to reopen government. It included, one of the bills included money for border security, but not for the border wall. It would have reopened government and given Republicans almost everything that they wanted on border security, except for the wall. The Senate said no thanks. Trump would have vetoed it anyway from the reports that we saw. So it's a lie that Democrats aren't coming to the table. That's one that Shepard Smith did not fact check, otherwise doing a good job. I mean, he just told the truth. He just told the truth about what it is that Donald Trump said. Trump, the great negotiator, doesn't seem to know how negotiations are supposed to work. And we'll talk more about the latest attempt at those negotiations after the break. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Kevin Klebs. Kevin, thank you. Really appreciate your support through the membership program, the #1 way that this program is funded. We also have people who have been with us for way too long to be called new members of the day, but just long enough to be called sustaining member of the day, Hall of Fame member of the day. And today that's Dustin Nichols, who's been with us for almost 5 years. What a great day for Kevin Klebs to be new member of the day, because Dustin Nichols is sustaining member of the day. And you can join both of them at www.joinpakman.com. If you think this is a good program, if you think this program is a net positive to have in the world, consider supporting us financially. It doesn't cost a lot of money, and you can drop the cost of your membership by 40% using the coupon code THISIS2020. Okay, we have some interesting discussions that our audience is engaging in on the David Pakman Show subreddit, which you can find at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. The first one brought up by one of the more than 8,000 viewers and listeners regularly participating. They asked, in relation to my clip earlier this week about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's 70% marginal tax rate proposal or idea, will a steep progressive tax system encourage the wealthy to leave the country? David, or anyone who's willing to share opinions, I've recently read that France is struggling with protesters since Macron is unwilling to raise taxes on the wealthy. Last time they tried, tax revenue went down due to these wealthy taxpayers simply leaving the country. I morally and economically accept the basis of a progressive tax system, but do we underestimate the potential of the same thing happening in the United States? We had a progressive system in the 60s, but it must have been much harder to move to a different country then. Well, we still have a progressive system, is point one. It's just not as steeply progressive at the top end. So I've heard this brought up a couple of times. There's a few things to consider. Number one, based on the law, just moving to another country out of the United States does not eliminate your tax responsibility to the United States. You can get out of paying taxes to the U.S. if you not only move out, but relinquish your citizenship. In order to do that, unless you want to have no citizenship, which I don't know if that even really works, you need to have citizenship elsewhere. So simply saying I'm out and I don't have to pay taxes to the U.S. anymore, it's actually much more difficult to do. The other thing is that taxes, if you want to go somewhere with significantly lower taxes, such that it would justify uprooting and leaving the country in which you live, there aren't that many places most Americans would enjoy living that have significantly lower taxes. Yes, there are places where if a more progressive tax system was put in place here, Western developed countries with slightly lower top marginal tax rates. There's no question about that. But at a certain point, it would become a question of, can you actually stop paying the American taxes if you leave? If you never plan to come back, you can just not pay them. Just don't come back to the U.S. ever. I don't think most Americans who would be leaving for tax reasons plan to never come back at all. And then it's also, how much do you save versus the trouble of uprooting and moving? So would some people move out of the U.S. with a high top marginal tax rate? Yes, they would. Would their tax liability to the U.S. go to zero? Not for most of them. And would it really be worth it to them to uproot and abandon their country? You'd have to ask them. But the number of people who would actually do it, I don't think is as big as this poster is suggesting. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, this again, a poster asking, who will be the first to accuse David Pakman of sexual misconduct? A hashtag #MeToo poll. This has come up in Patriot Mail before, and the options are that someone that I went to school with is going to accuse me of sexual misconduct, someone who I taught, I guess, at Boston College, someone who worked on the show, someone who works in the same industry, like someone else, I guess, from progressive media, someone I went on a date with, or a fan. I can assure you that there is not going to be any credible allegation of sexual assault against me. In fact, there was an attempt, I haven't spoken too much about this, but there was, I don't even know if you knew about this, Pat, I think I've mentioned it. There was a movement that tried to start floating fake sexual assault allegations against me. And they were very briefly investigated by the journalists who were contacted, obviously and immediately found not to be credible, and then it just kind of evaporated into thin air. So do I doubt that at some point someone will try to prove some kind of point against me by making those allegations? Sure, I don't doubt that. I think that that's already happened and that could happen again. But for people waiting for my downfall because of a Me Too moment, I would not hold my breath if I were you.
Yeah, in the wake of the Me Too scandal, Me Too movement, there were so many right-wingers who were saying that just about every man is at risk and anyone can accuse anyone of sexual assault and it's going to be viewed as credible and believed. This kind of shows otherwise. It's not so hard to make up a fake sexual assault allegation and get away with it.
Yeah, it is hard, in fact, is what you mean. It actually is difficult to make that up, yeah. DavidPakman.com/REDDIT. Join the discussion, respectful political discussion. Okay, this you're going to love this. Donald Trump, as you know, believes himself to be a great negotiator, a strong deal maker. He gets things done. He gets results, all of that stuff. Now, of course, the reality is that the opposite is true. The government shutdown, border wall fiasco has proven that. Trump couldn't convince Mexico to pay for the wall. Then he couldn't get taxpayers to want to pay for it. Couldn't convince Democratic leaders to give him the money for it. So he shut down the government, just like he promised he would do. And then he did this primetime propaganda speech about the immigration crisis, which came off as completely not credible. It actually lost in the ratings to the Democratic response speech by Pelosi and Schumer. Hilarious. We already talked about that earlier on in the program. The latest hilarity and embarrassment for Trump is that he brought back yesterday the Democratic leaders, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, Chuck Schumer, Senate Minority Leader, brought him back to the White House for another, quote, negotiation. And within minutes, Trump had stormed out like some kind of petulant child after simply making the exact same ask. Are you ready to pay for my border wall now? Nancy Pelosi said, no, we're not. And then Trump stormed out of there and no more discussion was had. We first learned about this. Actually, I don't know if we first heard about it from Pelosi and Schumer or from Trump, but the first we heard from Trump about it was this tweet, which he sent, saying, quote, just left a meeting with Chuck and Nancy, a total waste of time. I asked, what is going to happen in 30 days if I quickly open things up? Are you going to approve border security, which includes a wall or steel barrier? Nancy said no. I said, bye-bye. Nothing else works. So apparently, as we've now learned from other people in the room, this is just the best. This is the president. Trump more or less stormed in, said, are you going to give me the money for the wall if I reopen government? Pelosi says, no, we're not giving you the money for the wall. And he gets up and walks away. And Chuck Schumer was actually quoted on this entire thing saying, quote, unfortunately, the president just got up and walked out. we saw a temper tantrum. Wouldn't you think that for someone who is a master negotiator, he would understand that you don't come back with the same demand time and time and time again, conceding nothing if you don't have leverage or the upper hand? If you actually have leverage or the upper hand in some hostage negotiation situations where the hostage taker has no way out, or, right, we can all imagine situations where a negotiating party might have no leverage. And at that point, the other may be able to keep coming back to them with the same offer until eventually they break down and accept it. But Trump's not in that position. He's in a position where you have to compromise on something here. And it can't just be, I will allow you to reopen government if you do everything else that I want, because he's the guy who shut it down in the first place. The Republicans have fully bought into pushing the narrative that this is the fault of Democrats and that it's the problem of Democrats and that Democrats are the problem in the negotiation. Mike Pence said Democrats won't give in and fund the wall, so this is their fault. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says Democrats are holding everything hostage for partisan spite. That line hasn't worked well so far with the American people. That can always change. But the story here is that there is an accusation of shared blame or allegations of democratic obstruction. That's a joke. Trump knew that it wasn't going to be easy to get taxpayers to pay for the wall by asking the House for money. He still opted to threaten to shut down the government proudly over it, as he said to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer a couple of weeks ago. He then did shut it down. And of course, as predicted, Democrats aren't saying, oh, you're going to shut it down? Well, here, take money for the wall. They're not doing that. So Trump's the one making no concessions. He keeps asking for the same thing endlessly and blames the other side. Pat, do you think that Trump believes he's winning here when he has another meeting, he gets nothing out of it, and he storms out with a temper tantrum? Apologies for punching my mic. Do you think he thinks that he's winning here?
In the moment, I do think that he's winning and he's being a master negotiator. The problem is, as you kind of alluded to, you can't just storm out when you eventually have to make a compromise. Like if you're trying to sell me a car for $10,000 and I'm only willing to pay $5,000, we can't meet in the middle. I can walk away from that deal, right? I can just go buy another car. Eventually, the government has to be reopened. So they're going to have to find some solution here. And just his inability to cajole, to get along, I think that's really preventing any sort of talks from taking place.
The one indication that maybe Trump is increasingly frustrated because he realizes he's not winning is that New York Times report that I mentioned earlier in the show, which says that Trump didn't even want to do the border wall speech on Tuesday and that he didn't want to go to the border today. It would suggest that maybe he has some connection to the reality of the sort of impasse that he's created. As far as his followers go, questions open to you. I know we have some Trumpists in the audience. Do you see Trump as winning so far? Do you see Trump as portraying strength so far in his role in these completely failed negotiations for border wall funding, the fake crisis speech, the shutdown? Do you see him as having accomplished anything? Do you see him as being in a position of power increasingly? I see that he has no leverage whatsoever, and increasingly his administration is now panicking, trying to figure out how can we actually help some of the people being hurt by the shutdown, because otherwise we're going to lose this and we're going to lose them as voters in 2020. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Instagram at david.pakman. While you're there, follow the show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Quick break, back after this with a very interesting interview that I hope you'll join me for.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Jason Stanley, who's a professor at Yale University, author of the book How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, also author of How Propaganda Works. Knowing how both of these things work is of particular importance right now, I would say, Jason. And I think maybe a good place to start is When we think about fascism and maybe authoritarianism as well, we can have elements of those mechanisms in society without literally having a fascist dictator that is in place, right? Can you talk a little bit about how one does not require the other?
Absolutely. So my book, How Fascism Works, is based on an analysis of fascist politics and rhetoric. So not what a fascist dictator does, because there's many different things that a fascist dictator does. But even when you have fascist politics and rhetoric and ideology floating around in the public sphere, that's harmful for a democracy, because ultimately democracy is a culture. It's a culture that respects liberty and equality. And foundational to liberty and equality is truth. So it's a culture that respects truth, because without truth, you can't speak truth to power. Fascism, by contrast, is when you have fascism in the public culture, then it starts to wear down the democratic culture by wearing down our mutual respect for truth, our mutual respect for a shared reality, and our mutual respect for one another, our mutual respect for our fellow citizens. So democracy is ultimately a culture. It's not a voting system, because if no one respects the truth and everyone is just like filled with conspiracy theories, then who cares how they vote? It's not going to like reveal anything. Democracy is a culture, and when you have people filling the public space with conspiracy theories, raising panic and fear, detaching policy from reality in favor of advancing their own power, then you wear down a democratic culture. And when you wear down a democratic culture, even if your democratic institutions are fairly robust, you still have a worry for the future of your democracy.
Yeah, so I think this is great context for the conversation we're going to have in analyzing what's taking place today, which is we are talking about a culture of fascism or authoritarianism, not an actual fascist dictator in the sort of 20th century historical sense. And thinking along those lines, if we can, what are the signs that you are seeing moving over the last several years that should be concerning to those who don't want that type of society to develop?
Well, we have what the scholar of fascism, Robert Paxton, calls staples of fascist movements in our politics. We don't have a fascist dictatorship. We have a robust opposition party that won the midterms. So we have a robust opposition party. We have robust democratic institutions. But there's two worries about our institutions, and that would be, number one, the attack on our voting system, voter suppression, voter disenfranchisement. Hannah Arendt always warns that a sign of totalitarianism is when politicians betray loyalty to party over parties, by which she means loyalty to their own political party over a multi-party system. And I think we are seeing too much loyalty to a political party. When you see Americans more loyal to their political party than they are to their democracy, that's a worry that people's faith in democracy has eroded. So that's one thing, the kind of party loyalty we're seeing, which is very dangerous. More specifically about fascist staples, we're seeing politics that is completely detached from reality. We're seeing in recent days, to take an example of Mr. Trump's speech about the wall, we're seeing the manufacture of crisis. And what is crisis but an opportunity to suspend normal rules? We've been here before in the aftermath of 9/11 when we suspended rules about enemy combatants. Moments of crisis are perilous moments for democracy. And we've gotten too used to, in this country, suspending normal rules for claims of crisis, be they terrorism, financial crisis, as in Michigan, the disaster that led to Flint, Michigan, an emergency manager to deal with a financial crisis. We should have absolute lines in the sand about national emergencies, because those are moments that allow undemocratic actions, by definition, to occur. We're seeing a rhetoric of vicious xenophobia directed against immigrants, which is always a sign of, it's an invariable sign of fascist movements, that kind of xenophobia.
It's a classic.
Because it's a classic, because there's an appeal there to purity, to a pure ethnic national past where the country was great, and it's been ruined by liberalism, by feminism, by immigration. So we're seeing that classic rhetoric. We were once great. We were once an empire. I mean, you saw this, Hitler, Mein Kampf is all about this, about Germany was once great. He talks about lax immigration rules have ruined the country, Jews bringing in non-whites into Germany by lax immigration rules. So we're seeing classic staples. We're seeing rallies, Mr. Trump's rallies, chanting, rhythmic chanting, rather than sort of discussion of policy details. We're seeing we're seeing a replacement of truth and devotion to democratic ideals with loyalty. Like, when people say, I mean, the president himself, ever since he ran for office, has been talking about his bond between him and his supporters. And that's not a bond you want a politician in a democratic society to have.
So let me, that's a few to get us kind of started. So let me make an opposing case to allow you to tell us why this is not just politics as usual in the United States. The chanting, to kind of go backwards. Yes, we can. We heard chanting when it was Barack Obama, right? So the chanting alone is not really a sign. Politicians lying, alternative facts, etc. You see, if you find the pro-Trump enclaves of the internet, the refrain that, listen, everybody lies. We just are more comfortable with the fact that Trump is doing it for the greater good, but it's not unique that Donald Trump is lying. Using fear and emergency to try to achieve political wins. That's not particularly new. I mean, we could go on, but I guess the question is this a matter of degree, or are we truly seeing something different here?
It's a matter of degree, because in the United States, I mean, I adverted in my former remarks to the dangerous moment following 9/11. In moments of genuine crisis, there is always a concern about anti-democratic takeover. And we saw that with Vice President Cheney. We saw under the Bush administration, harshly anti-democratic measures. So now you have an element about the chanting, about the yes, we can, about the hero worship. Well, so people like to use the term populism. And there's an element in all successful politicians' runs for office of populism. So, of course, President Obama had a cult of personality as well. However, when Steve Bannon said, we got elected on build the wall and lock her up, I'm not sure that President Obama got elected on yes, we can. I think President Obama got elected on a financial crisis, on a sense that the elites had just completely destroyed the country and were not paying for it, and so it was a moment of crisis, and Obama promised a different direction. In contrast, what we have now is a manufactured crisis. So you've got to pay attention to reality. As I said, democracy requires a firm grip on reality, and that brings us to your next point about lying. There's lying and there's lying. This president goes to great extremes. Yes, President Obama, misled us in many ways. He was much more connected to the financial industry than the Americans who elected him might have wanted. All democratic politics involves concessions. There's big money in politics, so all democratic politics involves stretching the truth, making the common interest seem like making the interest of your donors seem like the common interest. But right now we have an unprecedented scale of lying that is destroying, and the problem is it's destroying any respect for the truth in politics that anyone had. So Mr. Trump's supporters, President Trump's supporters, I agree, they recognize that he's lying, and they think he's doing it for a greater purpose. But what's happening is no one's going to get punished for lying anymore. And when no one even pretends to tell the truth, then we have a real worry. I mean, before President Trump, I think one break, the lying and the conspiracy theories and the manufacture of crisis has gone to a different level here, because what we're seeing is people not caring at all. Earlier, you had to pretend you weren't lying. You had to maintain some kind of consistency from day to day. But we have an open attack on the truth, where the president is saying, you're with me or against me. And it doesn't matter what I say, you just believe in me.
Well, that actually, in hearing you talk about that, I'm reminded of, there's been a bunch of analyses done about, is what we're experiencing now more like George Orwell's 1984 or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World? I'm more of the mindset that it is becoming more like Brave New World than 1984. I'm curious where you would fall on that.
Why do you say that?
Well, in 1984, it was very clear who provided the so-called truth, right? You had the Ministry of Truth, or whatever it was called. Now I'm actually forgetting, was it Ministry of Propaganda, Ministry of Mini-True, I believe it was called.
Ministry of Truth. Yeah.
The world in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World was one where there was almost not even a desire anymore to figure out what is it actually that we should be paying attention to, what is it that matters, and that seems more like the way that it's going now.
That's absolutely right. And those of us who study Russian propaganda know this, that the goal is not to have an alternative narrative, but just to destroy the very idea of narrative at all. Just to replace all respect for truth by who's your guy, who's your man, who do you support, who's your team. That's the goal. So Timothy Snyder, in his book, The Road to Unfreedom, talks about what he calls implausible deniability. When he says, when Vladimir Putin talks, he's often saying things that are completely implausible. And his audience knows that, and they enjoy it because it's a show of strength. What he's trying to do is he's trying to not impose some sort of weird counter narrative, but just spin out so many different stories that no one knows what to believe anymore. And all they're left with the idea, that's our guy, we believe in him.
Yeah, and it's sort of like a white flag where you say, it's almost too difficult to figure out what the truth of the facts are. So I'm just going to stick with the person that I think has the rhetoric that resonates with me in some way.
That's right. Who talks, who uses the terms, who uses the chants that I agree with. Now, as you said, it isn't just a chance. It isn't just, yes, we can. I mean, I think there's a degree of difference here. There's a degree of how much did President Trump win on policy proposals, and how much did he win on, talking about the cities burning, immigrant rapists. Another aspect that we're seeing now is we're seeing the normalization of vocabulary that should never be normalized in a liberal democracy, that should never be normalized in a country that has as a value equal respect. Now, if you look at the literature of the European extreme right, like Guillaume Fay's 2001 Why We Fight, these are toxically white supremacist books. They talk about, Guillaume Fay recommends to politicians, to far-right politicians, to use the term aliens for non-Europeans. He says, we have to make people recognize, see what these people really are. They're aliens. They're not like us. They're alien intruders. Our government, from the White House on down, from the Oval Office on down, uses the term illegal aliens to describe human beings. That is terminology that, should not be used in a liberal democracy that has equal respect as a chief value.
This is actually a big piece of how this administration communicates political ideas, the strategic use of these types of terms.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're seeing more and more of these terms from white nationalism enter into the vocabulary. Obviously, we're seeing nationalist and globalist enter into the vocabulary. So we're seeing a lot of we're seeing attacks on the liberal democratic norm of equal respect under the guise of political correctness. So and we're frankly being conditioned to, as the Bush administration did as well. So this is not new, and President Obama with drone strikes, and our foreign policy has been dehumanizing people for a long time. But now we see the tension between having a liberal democracy and being a country that kills a lot of people. It becomes easy to lose your grip on the fundamental democratic value of equal respect.
This is just a fraction of the great discussions that are in Jason Stanley's books, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, and How Propaganda Works. Jason, really appreciate you taking time to talk to us about this today.
Thank you very much. Great discussion.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The Center for American Progress's Moscow project has now revealed that the Trump campaign and Trump transition team members had more than 100 contacts with Russia-linked officials. And in the last couple of weeks, we've learned about some of the deeper ties. We're starting to see how it all fits together. The Russian lawyers, Russian intelligence people, Kremlin-linked businessmen. It's sort of a full slate cast of characters. But what is now clear is that when you sort of step back a little bit and consider contacts in general, this was not casual contact between the Trump administration and Russians, right? It wasn't, well, there was some casual contact with people who happened to be Russian, and casual contacts with the Chinese, and casual contacts with the Japanese, and casual contacts with Chileans all throughout the campaign, because they were merely running a campaign and happened to have contact with people from all over the world. The foreign contacts are heavily concentrated operationally around individuals from or linked to one country, and that is Russia. Once you establish that, you then have to figure out what was the purpose of the contacts, what were the ends that were achieved by virtue of having those contacts, and that's what Robert Mueller is now doing in his investigation. The point I've been making is one that is made in this Moscow report by the Center for American Progress. Over 100 contacts with Russians matters because in running a presidential campaign, you don't have 100 contacts with one foreign power if you're not coordinating anything and if there isn't something extensive going on there, period. There's another important point here. These are 100 contacts that are publicly knowable by going through all of the documents and various court filings about this. Who knows how many there could actually be that we haven't learned about yet because there's not public information about, and we should assume that there are more than just the ones that have gone public thus far. And the types of contacts that this includes are any contact by a Trump associate with individuals known to have ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin himself or to Russian intelligence, banks, and politicians. And remember that Russian banks are relevant since in Russia, many are effectively part of the government, although not officially in the legal sense. As an example, the number 100 was the number a couple of days ago until we now learned that convicted Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort shared campaign polling data with Russian business partner Konstantin Kilimnik. That now makes the number 101. And at this point, I feel it necessary to repeat this sort of key point. This is the most conservative assessment of the number of contacts, 101, because, number one, it consists only of contacts that are publicly known. They've appeared in public documents, including court filings. And number two, it is only contacts that we can identify and direct. If there were Trump people meeting with cutouts for Russian government officials or bankers or influencers, those wouldn't be included in this list. In terms of who was doing the contacting, some of the usual suspects are on the list. Michael Cohen, we know about. Roger Stone, we know about. Donald Trump Jr., Carter Page, Michael Flynn. But then there are some other interesting names. Ivanka Trump. We don't really yet know the full extent of her contacts with Russian-linked individuals. Anthony Scaramucci. I would have been less sure that Scaramucci was involved in this stuff himself. Jeff Sessions, of course, claimed under oath during a hearing that he had no contact, then ended up having to recuse himself on all Russia-related matters for the remainder of his tenure as Attorney General, because that simply wasn't true. So the bottom line on this is, number one, it's not surprising. Number two, the real number is obviously way higher than 101. And number three, I hope that someday this matters. That's really the most important thing, because the biggest coup of this atrocity for the Trump administration is that if Obama had done a fraction of this, the right would be rioting in the streets demanding that he step down. I'm not saying the left is better for not rioting in the streets. Maybe the left is busy working and living their lives. Maybe rioting in the streets is not what they feel would actually bring consequences to what it is that Donald Trump has done. But it could be the right thing to be doing, to be rioting in the streets and demanding that Trump step down. But the question mark that remains is, will there be consequences for any of this stuff? Because if there isn't, this would be an amazing victory for the Trump campaign and transition team, having this degree of contact, this degree of criminality, and ultimately getting out of it with, yes, some people indicted and convicted and doing some nominal amount of time in prison, but big picture, not with major consequences. Lots of good conspiracy theories involve so-called shadow governments. A shadow government, according to the conspiracies, is more or less the idea that the official government we know about, the one where, you know, there's a president and a Senate and a House of Representatives and a Supreme Court, all of that stuff, that they don't actually wield the power, okay? A shadow government conspiracy theory claims that the real official government are puppets, but that the actual power is held by private individuals or corporations, depending on the conspiracy theory. Sometimes it's organizations like the Bilderberg conspiracies are factions of this. The Jews sometimes, the Vatican, the Freemasons, many flavors of this one. And the deep state is another one which has been sort of popular during the Trump administration. It's not actually the government as we see it publicly that holds the power. It's this deep state entity that is actually wielding the power and holding the purse strings and the puppet masters of what our government officials do. Of course, there's always like a shadow of truth to these conspiracy theories. That's how people get pulled in. So with this one, it's, well, okay, yeah, there are elites and corporations that do have way more power, disproportionately compared to Joe Schmo, lower middle class guy. That's true. And that's what gets people sucked into this stuff. And then they go down the rabbit hole of the really belligerent and outrageous ideas. So that's all a setup to tell you that Donald Trump's son, Eric Trump, not known to be the most intelligent one, he suggested on Twitter that liberal comedian Ellen DeGeneres is part of such a deep state conspiracy shadow government. And the tweet is so insane that he eventually deleted it, but we have the text of it to show you. Eric Trump tweeting on January 3rd, shocking. Once again, here are the Twitter suggestions of who I should follow. Hashtag deep state. And then he links to a picture which showed that Twitter's algorithm was suggesting to him that he follow Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and Ellen DeGeneres on Twitter. Quite a conspiracy the deep state has cooked up, huh? The deep state, this all-powerful shadow government, is trying to manipulate people up to and including the son of the President of the United States by suggesting that he follow Ellen DeGeneres on Twitter, as well as a former president and someone who lost the presidential election more than 2 years ago at this point. The thing about this one, Pat, is that it's so stupid and so dumb, and he was so roasted for it, that even he ended up deleting the tweet to try to take attention off of it, because it is, quite frankly, absolute idiocy.
Yeah, not the brightest bulb on the tree, that's for sure. But at least Eric Trump is an inspiration to some of us. Even if you're not the smartest, even if you're not the hardest working, you can still become rich and successful as long as your grandparent starts some successful real estate company and you live off of his successes.
Yeah, I don't know if that's an inspirational tale or a depressing tale. That we are reminded by Eric Trump and Ivanka and Don as well, but in particular with Eric, you don't have to be smart. You don't have to be a good person. You don't have to be likable. You don't have to be reasonable. You don't have to have a sensible head on your shoulders to end up with a ton of money in the United States. But we actually already knew that. So it's either a tale of inspiration or something that should make us all very, very depressed. But to get back to the shadow government that Eric Trump alluded to, I would probably trade in the Trump government with a Republican Senate for one run by Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Ellen DeGeneres. Like, is it crazy to think that we would be better off with Clinton, Obama, and Ellen running the government than what we actually have? That actually seems favorable to me.
If you throw in Oprah Winfrey and like Steve Harvey, I think I may be convinced at that point.
I read a funny comment online that Eric Trump is just jealous that Ellen DeGeneres is able to date more attractive women than he's able to date. But that's an insult to Eric's wife if he's still married. I don't know if he's divorced also. So I won't make that joke myself. I'll just quote someone else who made it on the internet. Okay, we have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. You can call anytime. Here was a voicemail with an interesting idea, but one that I'm not convinced of, related to government shutdowns. Take a listen to this.
Hey, David, I was wondering, with all the government shutdowns that have been happening through the past few years, why doesn't Congress pass an amendment to stop that eventuality from occurring in the future? Thank you. Love your show.
So, good question. Why not just make it illegal to shut down the government, or why not pass an amendment that eliminates a mechanism for allowing the government shut down, some provision that automatically keeps government going no matter what? The reason they're not going to do that is neither side wants that, okay? Both sides want the possibility of a government shutdown as an influence tool. And remember that since most things still operate during a government shutdown, the politicians still get paid, it's not to their advantage to make shutdowns illegal by passing an amendment. You want to have a shutdown as a tool to use when you think it's to your advantage. If it's the other party that shuts down the government, it gives you something to criticize and creates negotiation points for the reopening of the shutdown, whereby you may be able to achieve things that are valuable to your constituents or to your donors, as the case often is. So that's why they're never going to make a shutdown impossible or illegal. The shutdown is a political football, but it's one that both sides can take turns throwing, although I don't want to both sides it totally, because it's Republicans who have been attempting to use government shutdowns to achieve political successes over the last many, many years. But neither side, in the way, any time that a shutdown can either work in your favor or backfire against your opponent, you're not going to make shutdowns against the law or ban the possibility that they happen, because it could be at any time to either side's advantage, either to shut it down or to have their opponents shut it down, and that's why it exists. On today's bonus show, we will talk about how people over age 65 are the most likely to share fake news, according to a new study. Denver could become the first United States city to decriminalize magic mushrooms, hallucinogenic mushrooms, as some know them. And police are now collecting staff and employee DNA to find out how a woman in a vegetative state ended up having a baby. An incredibly disturbing story, and one of many that we will discuss on today's bonus show. I'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.